Darkcast Network, the light shines brightest on our indie podcasts.
Content warning ahead. This podcast contains very sensitive topics such as missing persons, unsolved cases, haunted houses, and paranormal activity. These type of topics can contain very upsetting and sensitive details and stories. Please listen responsibly. Welcome to Misty Mysteries. I'm your host, Keely. This is a paranormal and true crime podcast, and I'm so excited to talk about today's topic because I'm talking about Alcatraz. And as a born and raised Californian, a place like this in our history is always so interesting to me. With that said, let's dive right into the history of Alcatraz Island. This island is located in the waters of San Francisco Bay. Now, excuse my bad Spanish for a moment, but I'm gonna have to use some of what I know. It was first colonized in 1775 by Spanish explorer Juan Manuel de Aloya. He named it La Isla de las Alcatrazes, which translates to Island of the Pelicans, due to the original inhabitants of the island. It later got shortened to what we know it today as Alcatraz Island, when President Millard Fillmore signed an order to reserve the island for military uses, and a fortress named Alcatraz was built. This fortress was made to be impregnable by outside forces due to the build and location of the island. The fortress housed over 100 cannons for protection and the first operational lighthouse on the west coast. Although the fortress soon became a holding place of military prisoners, and it was deemed a great place for a prison, since it was believed no one could survive the 1.5-mile swim to the mainland in cold, shark-infested water. As essentially a military prison, it held Confederate sympathizers during the Civil War and citizens deemed treasonous for siding with the Confederate side. The indigenous people of America were also sent to this island when labeled as rebellious against the colonization of their lands, homes, and communities. This included 19 Hopi people who were sent to the island in 1895 after a land disagreement with the government. This population at this now military prison only grew further during the Spanish-American War. This growth of inmate population prompted a new construction that still stands today. This construction finished in 1912, adding a new cell house of 600 new cells, a hospital, a mess hall, and other prison buildings. This new construction made the buildings on Alcatraz the largest reinforced concrete building, and it continued to be a military prison until almost 20 years later in 1933, when the Army gave the prison over to the United States Justice Department, who saw this as a perfect location for a new federal prison. They wanted to make Alcatraz a prison where they could house inmates that were deemed too dangerous or difficult to deal with in other penitentiaries around the country. Their first step in making this a reality was more construction to secure the complex further. The construction finished and Alcatraz reopened as a maximum security prison on July 1st, 1934, under the first warden of the prison, James A. Johnson. At this point in time, the island had one main building for the prisoners, and it was made up of 4 block cells, A through D. Then there was also a exercise yard, a library, a chapel, an inmate's barber shop, a morgue, and an underground area called the dungeon that was last used when it was a military prison. There were additional buildings on the island for the 300 civilians that lived there, such as housing for the warden and his family, which was a mansion, and housing for the guards and their families, which was apartment complexes, an officer's building, a bowling alley, and a fountain soda shop, as well as a general store. The inmates at Alcatraz lived a very structured lifestyle, and the warden had to hire the proper amount of guards to help keep not only the peace with such a dangerous set of inmates, but maintain a strict schedule. He had to hire 3 guards per inmate, which led to the additional buildings they needed to house them. As for the inmates, Alcatraz was made to house 336 inmates. Although it usually held about 270 inmates at a time, at the maximum held 301 at one time. This was less than 1% of the entire federal inmate population. But Alcatraz was one of the most expensive prisons to maintain for the Justice Department. It cost 10 times the amount of other prisons to maintain, less than 1% of the entire federal inmate population. A number of things played a factor into why it cost so much to maintain, but in my mind, the cost to maintain the amount of guards and to import everything on the island to make sure the island was not only safe, but on a strict schedule probably played a huge part. Now, as for this schedule they maintained, they started at 6:30 a.m. every morning. After waking up the inmates, they had 20 minutes to get their cells in order. They then were called for rounds where they lined up to eat breakfast. The inmates were called for rounds 12 times a day and only had 4 rights while living at Alcatraz, which were food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. The inmates always lived one per cell, and for a short time, they had to obey a silent rule where basically they could not talk outside of meals and recreational time, although this ended in the late 1930s. But with good behavior, they could earn the right to visit the library or go to church, work on the island, listen to music or watch movies, have materials for hobbies like painting or drawing. They could play sports like softball or baseball. They could play chess, checkers, or dominoes, and be able to have communication with family or even receive visits once a month. As wild as this may sound, even with this idea of an inescapable prison, strict schedules, and living with some of the worst criminals, there were some inmates who requested to be transferred to Alcatraz for their safety. In prison, having a cellmate leaves you vulnerable, and the idea of having a single cell seemed like safety for some of the men who wanted to transfer. Although there can only be so much safety when you're housed with such dangerous criminals. Keep in mind, this was where men like George Machine Gun Kelly spent 17 years. Gangster Alvin Creepy Corbis spent over 25 years. Gangster Al Scarface Capone spent 4.5 years there to cut him off from all contacts to the outside world. And the worst many old guards on the island ever encountered, Robert Shroud, also known as the Birdman of Alcatraz. He was transferred there after he killed a guard at a federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. He served 17 years at Alcatraz, during which he spent his time in Cell Block D. Cell Block D is where the most dangerous of Alcatraz were housed, and Shroud seemed to fit right in. According to the old guards of Alcatraz, Shroud was kept here because he had to be kept away from other inmates for their safety. When it was time for him to shower, all other inmates were in their cells because Shroud was known to sexually assault and attack other inmates. Cell Block D was basically like hell for a lot of the inmates in Alcatraz. This was not only where the worst criminals were held, but it was where 6 solitary confinement cells sat. On Dead Files, a paranormal investigation TV show I watched during my research, the producer brought in an old inmate named Robert, who served time between 1954 and 1959 for a collection of armed robberies, to speak about his time in Alcatraz. He shared that at one point of his stay, he was sent to solitary confinement. He stayed in the cell for about 29 days. He explained that when he was put into the cell, he was stripped of all of his clothes and left in the cell. This cell is made of steel. It has no windows, one set of bars that separate the guard who opens the door and the prisoner. When he and other inmates were put into the cell, they then turned off the lights of the cell, leaving them in the dark. Every morning, the door was opened to give them water and bread, except on the 3rd morning, when they were given a meal consisting of potato, peas, and chopped raw onion. These meals were how Robert kept track of his time he spent in solitary confinement. Many inmates experienced these awful cells and living conditions in them, but the worst one had to be 14D. This solitary confinement cell was known as the Hole. It was always 20 to 30 degrees colder than any other cell and possibly haunted by an entity with glowing yellow eyes. Inmates and guards at Alcatraz called this the Thing. In the Hole, many inmates complained about seeing the Thing when the doors were shut and they were in the dark. But it wasn't until one particular inmate that this story really took a turn. One inmate in the 1940s was put into the Hole, and the next day he was found strangled on the floor of the cell. Rumor has it that the night before his death, the guard had shut him in the dark cell, and he began to scream for help, saying a creature with glowing eyes was in the cell with him trying to kill him. He screamed all night until all of a sudden he went quiet. He was found deceased the next day from strangulation, determined not to be from his own hands. From that day on, reports from guards and inmates came in about this man still walking cell block D. He often would appear and disappear right in front of guards and inmates. In cell block D, dread is an overall feeling felt in there. Smells of fire and rotting are often smelt. Screams, crying, footsteps, and moaning are heard. Batteries on cameras and phones drained and fully charged. This is just in cell block D. There are more deaths and tragic events in Alcatraz that have led to the haunting of this old prison. In total, there were 37 deaths on record from the time it was a prison. 15 deaths at the prison were from natural causes. 5 died by suicide, and 8 were killed by other inmates. One of the most notable inmate murder was the death of Joseph Barsock. On May 28, 1951, Joseph was getting his haircut by Freddie Lee Thomas when they were whispering and then they started to raise their voices. Joseph then jumped out of the barber chair when Freddie went after him with the barber scissors. Freddie stabbed Joseph in the heart, lungs, and throat, killing him within 20 minutes of the attack. After the attack, Freddie told Joseph that he loved him and then kissed him on the cheek. The two were partners, which ended in a domestic violence attack. Most of these tragic events, though, started with attempts to escape and ended with the deaths of inmates or guards. Records show that 36 inmates participated in 14 different attempts to escape from Alcatraz, including some who tried to escape multiple times. Of these 36 inmates, 23 were caught returning back to the island. 6 were shot and killed during their attempt, 2 drowned in the water, and 5 were never found but presumed dead. One of the most violent escape attempts took place on May 2, 1946, when Bernard Paul Coy, aided by an accomplice, Joseph Seitzer, attacked a guard in the gun gallery, taking the weapons for themselves and taking 9 more guards hostage, locking them in 2 separate cells. They then let 3 other inmates, Clarence Carnes, Sam Shockley, and Marin Thompson, out of their cells. And their plan went as planned till they realized that they did not have the key to get out of the recreational yard, because the guard who they had taken the keys from actually took that key off and hid it in the toilet. When Joseph realized this, in a fit of rage, he began to shoot into the crowded cell of guards. Multiple guards were wounded, and this number rose as the guards and the Marines attempted to take the prison back. The inmates attempting to escape held the prison for 48 hours. And after 48 hours, the men had sent multiple guards to the hospital, taking the lives of Harold Stites, a guard who had previously fought off another escaped attempt, killing 1 inmate, and another guard, William Miller, who passed from his injuries he sustained during the battles later on. Joseph and Bernard, the 2 original inmates, and Marvin Hubbard were killed from gunfire while authorities took back the prison. Sam Shockley and Marin Thompson were captured alive and later executed together in the gas chambers at the San Quentin, California prison for their role in the death of William Miller. And Clarence Carnes received an additional 99-year sentence. The next escape that may be one of the few successful attempts to escape and one of the last few to take place in Alcatraz while it was still open was one that has inspired many books and movies and podcasts. But on June 11th, 1962, Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence England vanished from their cells and were never seen again. When it was realized they were gone, an investigation was conducted into their escape and showed that the men used a homemade drill to enlarge vent holes, a false wall segment to hide the vent holes, and realistic dummy heads with human hair that they placed on the beds to make it look like they were still sleeping to be counted and so they could escape. The 3 men exited through the vent holes they made, located near the rear wall of their cells, using the false wall to conceal what they had been doing. They then climbed the utility pipes to gain access to the roof through an air vent. They then climbed down the drain pipe onto the northern end of the cell house and made their way to the water. There they used prison-issued raincoats to make vests and rafts. 2 of these life vests were later found outside the Golden Gate with oars, letters, and photographs belonging to the brothers that were wrapped to make them waterproof. Several weeks after this attempt, a man's body dressed in the blue clothing, much like the prison uniform, was found near the coast of San Francisco. But that body had been in the water for a while and badly decomposed, too decomposed to be identified. There are many strong leads pointing at the brothers living out their days, including a letter that was possibly from one of the brothers, but this case is technically still open and a big piece of Alcatraz history. Alcatraz actually only closed a year after this escape, in 1963, because it was too expensive to keep open. Plus, it was in major need of construction to keep it safe for those on the island. Years passed after its closure until its next inhabitants. On November 20th, 1969, a group of Native Americans, led by a Mohawk activist, Richard Oakes, arrived on Alcatraz Island to claim the island on the behalf of the indigenous tribes whose lands had been taken from them. The government, when they found out about this, actually struggled to get a count on how many activists had taken the island, but the activists had made their intention very clear. They wanted this island, and they were going to make a Native American Studies Center, a Native American Spiritual Center, an Indigenous Center of Ecology, Indigenous Training School, and a Native American Museum. In this plan, they wanted to rid the island of every building except the historical lighthouse on the island. Discussions and meetings were taking place between the government and the activists, while the public split its support for the activists and for the government. Sadly, pretty early on in January of 1970, Richard Oakes and his wife lost their 12-year-old daughter in a horrible accident after falling off a 3rd-floor apartment. When she was taken away to the hospital on a U.S. Coast Guard's boat, Richard announced he would never be coming back to the island. With this departure, the activists started to divide, and many stopped working with the government. A boat was sent out to turn off water, and the activists had to rely on water bottles from the mainland. They attempted to collect support and supplies by doing tours in June of 1970, but the government determined that the buildings on the islands were unsafe and that anyone who came on the island would be trespassing. There were attempts to take the island back by the government, but the activists were still able to celebrate their 1-year anniversary occupying the island in November. By the 1-year anniversary, the number of activists started to diminish. Despite this, there were still talks of a bill to support them in January, but on June 11th, 1971, the occupation of Alcatraz Island came to an end, when 20 federal marshals landed on the island to remove the occupiers. During this, they had only found 6 men, 4 women, and 5 children on the island. Alcatraz Island then became part of the Golden Gate National Recreational Area in 1972 after a year of work to make it safe, especially after a fire damaged many of the buildings on the island. During the activists' occupation, Alcatraz was opened again for the public. Alcatraz has closed from time to time for construction and pandemics, but it has stayed open since for tours open to the public that may include a few inmates and guards left over in spirit from when it was a prison. As we learned in the history of the island, the paranormal activity began long before famous escaped attempts, the indigenous occupation of the island, and the visitors on the island today. While the prison was active, there was a very well-known claim of the Thing. This is the dark entity with glowing yellow eyes. It was seen in cell block D specifically when it may have taken the life of the inmate, screaming about the entity attacking him while locked in the hole. The Thing was seen all around the island in multiple forms as a set of glowing yellow eyes, or a man in old clothing leaving an otherworldly and dark feeling wherever it was seen. There is little to none of any record about what took place during the military hold on the island, including inmate records. What we do know is that inmates were treated awful during the military prison. So we don't know if they have ever seen the Thing. The first record of the Thing being seen was by inmates while it was a federal prison. At first, the guards would mock the inmates, not believing it, until they not only started to see the Thing in and outside of the prison, but they began to experience activity outside of the Thing. The event that truly made the guards believe something was happening on the island that they could not explain was at Christmas time in 1940, when Warden James Johnson was throwing a festive party on Christmas Day in his home for the guards. The party was fun until it came to a full stop. All of a sudden, the room's temperature dropped. The fire on the stove went out and everybody went quiet. Suddenly, a spirit of a man appeared in front of them, the whole party, wearing a brimmed hat, a gray suit, and rocking some mutton chops. For a full minute, all they could do was stare before he disappeared right before their eyes, and just like that, the temperature went back to normal and the fire was going again. But the room did not go back to normal. The men were filled with fear and wonder about what happened. They now had belief in what the inmates spoke about and a story to tell. As for the warden himself, he may not have witnessed this man with mutton chops at his party, but he was a strong skeptic of any strange happenings happening on the island. This was till he had his own stories to tell. Warden Johnson was leading a tour of the prison to some guests when they got to the dungeon and sounds of a woman crying started to be heard. Her cries were described as coming from inside of the walls of the dungeon. Then just as the crying stopped, the warden and his guests were met with a cold, icy breeze. We don't know if this changed how the warden felt, but his guards often heard the crying too, along with the moaning, screaming, loud crashing, running footsteps, and repeated banging noises in cell block C. There were also claims of horrible smells, of smoke or general awful smells. Spirits of men in old soldiers' clothing were seen walking around. Men in prison uniforms were seen, and some claimed to see indigenous spirits dancing, which they believed to be men who were imprisoned there during the military years. These hauntings carry on into today, all these years and guests later. Maybe it's because the island is made of rock that could hold on to energy, the density of the concrete being unforgiving of the past, the spirits who get stuck there, who are forced to be there for the crimes they may have committed in life, the energy of the water, or maybe all of it works together to make the perfect haunted location. As a famous historical and haunted place, it sees a variety of people from young to old, tourists, history, true crime, and paranormal fans. It has seen many paranormal teams and TV shows, many of which come with their own mediums. And these mediums have picked up on different spirits throughout the years. But one thing I found in my research was that all the mediums had one thing in common. When speaking to the spirits of Alcatraz, many of the spirits of inmates tell the mediums that this place is their hell for the things that they did in life. Many don't wish to be here but can't leave. Some have leftover anger about life, but most have sadness that many visitors become overwhelmed with. There are a number of famous spirits you may encounter while visiting the island. One of these would be a man who was known as Butcher. He was an inmate murdered by another inmate in the laundry area, but he now haunts the C block. An ex-inmate of Alcatraz who was actually friends with Butcher later returned to the prison for a tour. He was surprised when he returned to the prison many years later to see his friend standing in front of him, who he knew had passed away long before. He had also been called out by spirits who knew him as if they were excited to see their old friend. Other spirits would be Birdman of Alcatraz, Al Capone, and Rufy McCain. The Birdman is believed to be heard calling birds. Al Capone is believed to be heard playing banjo in the shower. Rufy McCain, an inmate killed by another inmate who he attempted to escape with, is connected to his old cell. This cell is always cold. People feel strong emotions when in his cell, and some old guards would see glowing red eyes coming out of his cell. And of course, I couldn't end this episode without talking more about the hole. Whenever you watch, listen, or read anything about Alcatraz, you cannot get away from cell 14D. The hole is deemed responsible for the death of an inmate, as well as others who served time in that cell being traumatized by what they saw. While visiting today, they will offer to let visitors get in the cell and be locked in. Some will feel nothing besides the scare you may expect when being locked in a dark old cell in a famously haunted location. But others have experiences that change their opinion on the paranormal or simply add to their long list of stories. One man named Bob Davis had such a strong connection to his paranormal encounter in the cell that he called the TV show Dead Files. Bob Davis was on a tour at 14 years old with his family. When the tour got to 14D, they asked if any volunteers would like to go into the cell. 14-year-old Bob took this opportunity. He walked in the back left-hand corner of the cell and the tour guide closed the inside bars, and then the guide came and closed the outside door, and the cell became completely dark. Bob was asked if he was okay by the ranger supervising. Right after he said he was okay, he felt someone grab his shoulder very sharply, and he heard a voice say, "You're mine," in his ear. He could feel the feeling of someone talking in his ear. He believes that this experience opened him up for more paranormal and makes him more sensitive. Ever since then, he has experienced the paranormal more than he ever could have imagined. The very last haunting is people looking at Alcatraz across the water will see a luminizing green light.
Hey there, friend. It's December, which means that holidays for many of us are right around the corner. Here at the Darkcast Network, we are preparing for the holidays in a very special way. We're collecting all our tales of the nice and naughty from all over the world to bring you 2 very special episodes featuring topics like the Dutch tradition of pickle in the tree and burning of the devil in Guatemala, true crime tales of killer kids, and the lore side of it all with Belle Snickle and La Lechuza. All this from some of your Darkcast podcasts like Autumn Oddities, Murder News, The Crime Diner, Mission Spooky, and me, host of Hands Off My Podcast. Put on your comfy pajamas, grab your mug of hot cocoa, and join us by the fireplace for some holiday tales. Available on the podcast feed you're listening to right now on December 19th and 20th.
For now, I want to thank you for listening. As this year comes to an end, I have a huge favor to ask you. I currently have a form to help me better understand what you like about the podcast and what you would like to see moving forward. I will have the link in the episode notes, along with a form that you can fill out to be added to my monthly newsletter starting in 2023, meaning you'll be the first to know what is happening with Misty Mysteries every month and what I have coming up this coming year. Please stay safe out there, enjoy your holiday season, and I will see you next week.